Welcome to the Grow Renaissance podcast. Let's nourish the world.
All right, welcome back to Pasture Prime Time, a Grow Renaissance podcast series, where the grass is always greener because we know who's grazing it and why it matters. Today's guest is someone who talks and walks gently, writes fiercely, and plants stories the way others plant seeds. We're thrilled to welcome Elspeth Hay, writer, forager, podcaster, and passionate advocate for agroecology, here to talk about her new book, Feed Us with Trees. At a time when monocultures sprawl and supermarkets peddle plastic-wrapped perishables flowing halfway around the world, Elspeth dares to ask, what if the forest could feed us better than the field? Her book is part of a memoir, part food manifesto, and wholly rooted in the possibilities of perennial abundance. So pour a cup of something wild, maybe some acorn coffee or hickory nut milk, and join us as we dig into how trees might not just save the planet, but also dinner. Elspeth, it's a pleasure to have you here, and I look forward to our chat. Maybe you can give us a bit of your background and what prompted you to dive into writing this book.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you for that beautiful introduction. I'm actually sitting here with a cup of reishi birch polypore tea, so comes
Very
from
nice.
the forest.
Very nice.
Yeah, so I live on Cape Cod. I've been reporting on food and the environment for a little over 15 years. And about 5 years ago, someone sent me a TEDx talk by a woman named Marcy Mayer in Greece who said that acorns are edible. And not just edible, but a superfood and one of our oldest human foods. And that totally blew my mind. I live in an oak forest. I'm looking out my window right now. There's oaks everywhere. And I live in an area where about 70% of the land is protected as part of the Cape Cod National Seashore. So it's federal land. And I had always seen this forest as an impediment to food production. So I was really surprised to learn that all that time and every week I interview someone about food and no one had ever mentioned acorns as a food source. So I fell deep down the rabbit hole of trying to figure out why don't we know this? Why don't we talk about this?
Right.
And that was about 5 years ago. So it was a pretty deep rabbit hole that I went down, and a lot of fun.
That's amazing. I noted as I was reading through the book there's a lot of ancestral knowledge, and you weave in ancestral recovery in your writings. From your perspective, and I hear a lot about this today, mixing tradition with, current state. How do we balance honoring that legacy with innovating new food, futures, and whether that's from forest or our current systems that we have there? But maybe we can speak a little bit to that, honoring the legacies of our ancestral.
Yeah, I think, as I went back and started trying to understand why most people, like me, I come from a European immigrant background, grew up in Maine, which is, I think I looked it up, like the second whitest state in North America. So I didn't have a lot of exposure to other cultures, other ways of eating. I was pretty much entrenched in like dominant American food culture. And I just kept going back, trying to understand how my people got disconnected from these trees. Because, when I learned acorns are edible, I found all this really old stuff saying, oh yeah, people all over the Northern Hemisphere had this relationship with these nut trees, not just acorns, but also hazelnuts, chestnuts. A lot of these trees in more ancient religions were revered as sacred. The Druids famously tended oaks. Even if you look at some of the Greek mythology going back, there's this reference from a shift to like oaks feeding us to grains. So I couldn't pinpoint, like, I don't know, how did we get disconnected? And I just kept following that back and ultimately finding that when, there was this internal colonization of England and then Europe before the colonial sort of invasion spread outwards. And that was kind of this moment where people had had this intimate connection with land for centuries, probably millennia, in the same places, in relationship with these trees. And in a lot of places, there was a whole story that had to get written in order to wrest that land from the people who had tended it forever. So this story in the book that I call No Farms, No Food was this idea that spread along with colonialism that, oh, there's nothing out there for us. And the idea was to make the land seem worthless, because if there's nothing out there for you, why do you care if it's private? Why do you care if it's being taken from, being in common ownership to being privately owned? And so I noticed a pattern in so many different places where there was this kind of violent disconnect, and I got really interested in that. And I think that in order to move forward, there's a lot of talk right now about agroforestry and regenerative farming. I think we need to deal with some of the cultural and social legacies of trauma and harm that brought us to where we are in order to move forward in a way that's truly regenerative and, culturally healing, as well as getting into this new relationship with the land.
I love that. I think there is a lot to be said about doing the homework, learning the histories of where we've gotten to, but certainly some of those past incidents and traumas, as you've mentioned. But also as a part of storytelling, I think there's a lot. I live in Canada. I do a lot of work throughout North America and globally, and I run into a lot of different First Nation or Indigenous groups. And in Canada, I've worked with a lot of them. And the one thing I see that they have that we don't, as sort of secular individuals and our own nations, is this storytelling. We read books, which are wonderful, and your book is fantastic. I've really enjoyed reading it. But sitting around, breaking bread, and telling stories is something I really cherish when I enter these First Nation communities, and I'm welcomed into their way of life. And it really is about connecting to things that are happening in that ecosystem that they live in. And so I would certainly second that in terms of dealing with some of that past knowledge base and trauma and rebuilding from there. Do you get a lot of pushback in terms of what agroforestry really is, and maybe this word syntropic agroforestry that comes up?
I haven't yet, but the book is just out, so I'll be curious to see where that conversation heads. I do get a lot of people who are very skeptical of the idea that these trees can actually produce enough food, and that was me before writing the book. So I feel like that's a conversation that I don't mind having, and I'm actually excited to have, because the whole no farms, no food story that I grew up with, at least, and I think a lot of us did, is this idea that, oh, we all used to be hunter-gatherers, but then we had to become farmers to produce enough food because hunting and gathering isn't as productive, and wild species don't produce as much as these domesticated species. And that is a myth, a lie that I really worked hard to debunk in the book. I think because I had to work hard to debunk it within myself. Like that was such a strong story for me, and I tried to trace it back. I grew up with this doll. There might be some other listeners out there that had an American Girl doll as a kid. I had Kirsten Larson, and a lot of girls my age did, and oh my God, I loved her. I played with her all the time, and she came with this set of books, and they told the story of her coming from Sweden and colonizing an area in the Midwest along with a bunch of other settlers. And there's all this talk about how the Indigenous people are moving west because there's not enough food, because there's more people. And if you actually look at the ecology and the facts, that's not true. An ecosystem that is centered on these keystone trees produces a lot more food than a monoculture. And what we do with monocultures, and I talked to a really interesting agronomist named Ricardo Salvador, who really helped me put this in perspective, is we count the land that we're producing on, but we don't count all the land that it took to produce the inputs. to make that productivity so high. So we're kind of doing this fake math, right? Because yield is a ratio and you have to count not only what you're getting out, but also what you're putting in. And it turns
Yes.
out that when you start counting that, because land is the limiting factor for producing food on Earth.
Yeah.
And when you count that, the high yields completely disappear and in fact go in reverse.
Yeah.
So that's just one of those stories that, I mean, once I started becoming aware of it and how prevalent it was, I see it everywhere. And you just realize you're so deep into the story that it's hard to see. And that I think is true often.
Yeah. I would agree with that. I mean, I spend a lot of my days, a lot of listeners know that I work in the farming sector, and I spend most of my time talking to farmers about not chasing yield, about focusing on moving to more diversified landscapes. So instead of the monocultures, the diversified rotations. But we still run up to this crux that we need to produce a living on those farm fields, and so the land is a limiting factor. And there's a lot of talk right now about CI score, carbon intensity, which is kind of related to what you're indicating, which is, are we aware of those external factors that go into producing the food, and how do we sort of mitigate or deal with some of those compounding effects in qualifying if this is a more carbon conscious food or healthier food, and how does that come about? And so there's a lot to be said. The industry's certainly shifting, but there's simple things we can do. Planting trees, food forests are massive. I'm curious, when I think of food forests, and maybe this was more of my permaculture sort of knowledge base, I typically always thought of it in urban settings, right? So you have a place in downtown New York and you build this food forest, and people come and forage and gather and get their dose of green and then go back to their condos or houses. You talk about it in relation to our farmland that can have an abundance of food forests built within those ecosystems. Maybe you can speak a little bit to some of those thoughts and perspectives around that.
Yeah, I had a couple visits to the Midwest visiting farmers who are really trying to create farms based on an ecosystem that existed prior to European colonization of the Midwest. It was oak savanna. A lot of the area was oak savanna, which has now become a really rare habitat. And if you look at what's in an oak savanna, it's all these incredible human foods. And at first, when I learned that, I thought, wow, that's so crazy. But it's really not, because it was an ecosystem created by humans, by Indigenous people burning and intentionally creating that ecosystem on the land. And there are now a lot of farmers who are starting to experiment with recreating that ecosystem intentionally in different ways. So maybe because there's not as much of there is no market for acorns right now, but there is a market for chestnuts. So people are planting chestnuts as an overstory tree, and then underneath hazelnuts, pawpaws, elderberries, hickories. I went to a place called Red Firm Farm in Iowa. I would imagine some of your listeners have heard of it. Tom Wall and Kathy Dice, they're doing amazing things with just combining basically as many different agroforestry species as possible. I visited Mark Shepard's farm where he had, I think, 139 species of edible perennials, which was pretty cool to see. But there's also some people experimenting a little bit with reintroducing fire into those ecosystems, which is how they were, created originally. So there's a lot of different ways of doing it, and I think the challenge right now is as you mentioned, largely economic, and figuring out how do you get that upfront investment, because a lot of these crops take 5 to 10 years to really come online and start producing. And then, we'll be around for a really long time and really productive for a really long time. But because of the way our economy is structured, that can be a challenge. And, we tend to talk about economic law and our economy the same way we talk about natural law and ecology. But our economy is completely made up. The rules are made up by us. And on the one hand, that's pretty depressing. But on the other hand, that's kind of exciting, because if we made it up, we can also change it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good thought there. We have that ability to change it, and it sort of is akin to something that I often talk about, which is ecology is messy. We try to control ecology, and so the ability to make up our own policies is a very human-centric way to control things, and we've done that in ecology. Agroecology in general is very structured, and we need to get good with being messy with it, and sort of letting it happen.
Yeah,
I will note I've got some pine trees on my own farm, and they're about to produce next year. They're a 15-year cycle before they actually produce pine nuts.
wow.
And next year is the year that they should be producing. We're seeing the buds come out, but it's been a long haul. Amazing trees, they smell great, but the actual food that comes off them takes quite a while. So I certainly understand that in terms of what you plant for immediate forage and food and what you plant for that long-term sustainability. There's a lot of knowledge there to be shared.
Yeah, there's another farm I visited in, I think, Iowa, Valley Chestnuts. Forgive me,
Mm,
Valley Chestnuts, if they're not in Iowa, but I think they are Sperry, Iowa, I think. And they, it was really the elder, the grandfather of the family, who saw what was happening with row crops and the machinery he was needing to use and the direction it was going in. And he had made a good living and had some money saved up. And for his kids and his grandkids and his great grandkids, he decided, I'm going to use this, economic power and this legacy that I have to invest in chestnut trees. And his kids and his grandkids are now seeing that payoff.
amazing.
And it was pretty incredible to talk to them and hear their story. And it took him 30 years, I think, maybe 29, 30 years of watching another farmer do it to really feel comfortable with it and think, okay, I'm ready to take this leap, because it is a
Mm-hmm.
big leap and it's a big decision. And, you know, if you're a farmer who's been growing row crops your whole life and you've been trying to keep trees out of your fields, this idea that actually we're going to intentionally put them in
Mm-hmm.
there can be a real mindset shift. And so it makes me grateful for the people who are doing sort of these early models, because a lot of people need to see a demonstration. They need to see something working before they're willing to take that leap. And it's exciting now that we're at the point where a lot of people have been experimenting with some of these systems in
Yeah.
the Midwest since the 90s. And other people are able to see these more mature trees and then feel a little more comfortable, like, okay, this is legit. This is something you can actually do.
Yeah.
And, groups like the Savannah Institute and organizations like that are also helping people take those jumps. And that's really exciting.
Absolutely. Yeah. I have a colleague of mine actually who does a lot of work with the Savannah Institute. As agroforestry is becoming a hotter topic within the farming community. Um, you mentioned these demonstration sites and some farms that you visited. Is there a food forest that you've been to that really stands out in all your travels?
I think one of the most interesting people I've spoken with is Philip Rudder. He started Badger Set Research Corporation back in the late 70s or early 80s. And he's doing this hybrid swarm breeding. So he's
Hmm.
breeding hazelnuts and chestnuts and some other species. But I went out there and spent a few days on the farm with him, and he's getting up there in years now. And so he's been at this for a while. And seeing what can happen in just a few decades with a really concentrated effort on a very specific type of breeding. So a lot of people are working on trying to get this one perfect tree through
Hmm.
crosses and then basically cloning it and
Hmm.
having a sort of static genetic situation, right? And you get a lot of the American chestnut work has been, we're going to try to get a tree with the timber form of the American chestnut and the nuts of the American chestnut, but the resistance of the Asiatic species. And then we're just going to replicate that tree. And I think that what the living world around us has shown us again and again is that that's actually not a great plan. When you only have one set of genetics, eventually something will go wrong. And there might be a place for those kinds of trees, but if that's the entire basis of our farm system, it's extremely vulnerable. I don't know a ton about bananas, but I've done a little bit of reading, and I think that's a huge vulnerability in the banana industry. It happened with hazelnuts out west. And so what he's doing, I think, is really exciting because he basically looked at the process that Indigenous people all over the Americas use to breed corn from teosinte. And it's this swarm breeding where you're just combining as much genetics as possible. And if you're doing, he'll do the math for specific traits and figure, okay, if we do 5,000 crosses, we'll probably get 8 plants with the traits we're looking for. And then we're going to cross those and we're going to look for these other traits. And I just think it's a really interesting approach, and one that has this long-term thinking that we tend to forget in our agricultural system overall. And it's also one that, the more people involved, the better. It isn't this sort of patented research situation. It's okay, if you get more people involved, more new traits emerge. And he had some hazelnut clusters with I can't remember the top one, but something like 20 or 30 hazelnuts. Normally you'll see maybe 4 or 5 on a little cluster.
Right.
And so I don't know, that was exciting, really exciting to see.
That is very exciting. Yeah, it's very interesting that there's these individuals out there that are really thinking outside the proverbial box, as it were, and we really need to amplify and find them and amplify those messages and what they're doing. Let's talk practicality. For someone that's never planted food producing trees before, what's a great gateway for them to get into thinking about planting food forest trees or trees that produce fruit for them, whether in their backyard or whether in a farm setting, an acreage? What does that look like?
I think the first thing to do, it's interesting because I was just talking to someone in Australia and I thought, what are we going to talk about? They have a completely different ecosystem. I don't know anything about it. Yeah. But I started thinking about it and I realized what's exciting to me about a lot of these nut trees in the Northern Hemisphere is that they are keystone species. That's why they're so exciting. And so I think I would advise people that if you don't know much about the ecosystem around you and planting food, the first thing to figure out is what are the keystone species in your area. A keystone species, for people who don't know, is a species that supports a lot of life. So it's as important as the keystone in a Roman arch, right? If you take that piece out, the whole thing falls apart. The same goes in a lot of North American ecosystems for a lot of these nut trees. So oaks are one of the top life support trees in almost every county where they occur. I know black cherry is actually another really incredible tree. Chestnuts, hazelnuts, we don't have the American chestnut anymore. But a lot of these trees that produce food are also keystone trees. So I would first recommend figuring that out, because if you're going to start messing with the ecology of a place, which anytime we're planting a garden or a farm or any ecosystem, we're messing with the ecology of a place. We talk about the natural world and farms as if they're these separate spheres, but that's just an arbitrary line that we've drawn. They're all just ecosystems around us. And I've actually stopped using the words natural world, because it's just the living world. The world is alive around us, and we need to figure out how to be in relationship with it. And then I think going back and understanding the ecological and social history of the place where you are. So what were the indigenous systems of food production in your area? How were they tended? And then once you've got that knowledge, I think enough to start thinking, okay, well, these are ways I could be a good steward of this place. So when I got really interested in acorns, I learned that a lot of oaks are co-evolved with human fire. And I ended up getting certified in prescribed fire, and have started going on some prescribed burns in my area where they're working to restore oak savanna ecosystems. And, when I go on the burns, I don't talk a lot. I just listen, because there's people who've been doing it a lot longer than I have. I'm pretty new. And there's so much to learn about the ecology of the places where we live once we start paying attention. And I think just getting those species right in the beginning, and then figuring, getting to know them like you would in any relationship. I think we tend to see trees as really different from humans, but if we just think of them as a living thing that has needs in a relationship, and in order to be in relationship, we need to understand those needs and try to meet them and have a reciprocal relationship, that will actually take you surprisingly far in figuring out what to do.
Yeah, I like that. So, do some homework, get familiar, and start evolving. Maybe that opens up a question. In writing this book, did your narrative change as you started to better understand trees, the food abundance that can come out of them? I'm sure you set off on a mission, and I'm curious if that changed over time to where you ended up.
Yeah, it changed a lot. The book took 5 years to write, so I was learning along the way, and I think my first drafts were pretty clinical, just hey, we could eat from these trees. But as I got to know different people along the way, especially an Indigenous man in present day California, Ron Reed, who's become a friend, he kept telling me, these trees are kin, other stuff that I understood it kind of, but it took me a long time to really absorb what he was saying and understand it better. And as he told me more about Kuruk, Kuruk people have relied on acorns as a staple food for since time immemorial. And he kept telling me all these ways that they take care of the oaks. So they have these world renewal ceremonies where they light sacred fire on the land, and that fire. And he would tell me, this fire is to renew the earth and to pray for all living things. And in my Western science brain, I would just think, I don't know what to do with this information. I can't translate this. But over time, as I would kind of connect what he was saying with Western science stuff, it was just a different way of speaking. But slowly over time, he would say it's our job to burn. It's our, we were put here to create habitat for other species. That's our cultural belief. And then I learned a little bit about keystone species, and actually there's different categories, not just oaks are keystone species, but there's other categories like predators, prey, and ecosystem engineers. And there are a lot of fire ecologists who think that that is our ecosystem niche. We're the fire animal, and we've tended a lot of different habitats all over the world with fire for millennia. And now that we're in this area of fire suppression, we're actually starting to see some of the shifts that happen when we don't do that job in an ecosystem. Just like if you removed a beaver, right? The ecosystem would really change. And so it was this really long process of integrating these stories that he was telling me with my own way of understanding the world, and the sort of realizing oh, okay, we're using different language, but I can come to the same place. I understand in a different way now what you're saying. And that took a really long time, and I think is ongoing work that will probably continue for the rest of my life. So I don't expect the story shifting to end anytime soon.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. That is beautiful. When I'm thinking about tree food, often I think about just sort of seasonal snacks. Like when we think about nuts, I don't think about them as, everyday reliable household food sources. What do you think is going to help us change that narrative, or is that a narrative that we need to change in a greater way?
I think that's where it's time to really get practical and start experimenting. Since completing the book, I've started doing more experimenting in my own kitchen. I've had a little more time, and just figuring out. It takes, most of us are so entrenched in our food ways, and that shifting that takes a while. I think, we need some cookbooks, we need some guides, we need help. We need to help each other. And I think
Hmm.
often, like, imagine if we lost everything we knew about wheat and then you're trying to make a croissant, right? Like, you're not just going to get there overnight. It's a little bit of a process. But I've been
Hmm.
excited by, I don't know if you've ever heard of the forager chef, this guy, Alan Burgo in
I have
Minnesota.
actually. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
so he, I think, is one of the people. Sam Thayer is another one in Wisconsin, really doing the work to put in the time and experiment and figure out how to make some of these foods more accessible. So,
Mm.
I've been making acorn flour and I have been making different things with it.
Hmm.
But a lot of people start out with like dessert, and that's great. But then it's like, okay, well, dessert is not a staple food. That's not what we're going to eat for every meal, or at least not if we want to feel good.
Yeah.
Um, and I've learned a lot from actually a friend in Switzerland there about chestnuts. There's an area of Switzerland where my friend lives, the Bregell Valley, where they have one of the largest sweet chestnut forests in Europe. And
Mm.
historically, there, the average person ate 330 pounds of chestnuts a year, which,
Wow.
just to put that in perspective, in the US, we eat an average of 150 pounds of grains per person per year. So that is just a stunning level of chestnut
No
consumption.
doubt. Yeah.
Yeah. And so talking with people there, I've learned about some different dishes and ways to incorporate chestnuts.
Hmm.
And but it's still just, you catch yourself going to the store and buying the same thing, or even going to the farmer's market buying the same thing.
Yeah.
And I think it's slow work, but really fun and exciting work. I just made a batch of chestnut crackers with a friend. We've been experimenting with crepes, like savory crepes with mushrooms and stuff inside. And so I think the more cookbooks, the better, and just the more experimentation, the better.
Yeah. I like that. You've now challenged me to start experimenting a little bit more. And
Yeah, we need
I'll
to
have
just
to.
exchange ideas.
Yeah. Where do you see technology coming in terms of near knowledge sharing or supporting the opportunity to get more exposure around food producing trees and food forests in general?
I think it's huge. I mean, there's a lot of people who I follow online who have, Alan Burgo, who I mentioned, the forager chef.
Mhm.
I cook stuff from his website all the time. And, you know, if we want to see cultural change, we need to work together. People will say, well, what should I do? And it's like, well, you know, I don't think one person should be telling everyone what to do. We need a lot of ideas and we need a lot of people working in this area.
Right.
And at least where I live, there aren't a lot of people doing this right now. And
Right.
so I think that the internet and social media, as much as, sometimes it drives me nuts, also is this amazing opportunity to connect with other people doing this work and to really form these networks and collaborate. I think I just saw, people like Black Forager, Alexis Nicole, she just
Mhm.
got some big recognition. And I think there is this recognition of, okay, this is real. People are sharing how to do it. Um, and it's getting a bit of momentum. And I think that is thanks to technology and the way that we can share stories and pictures and information with people across
Right.
huge distances. I mean, I have acorn friends now in Greece and California and England and Switzerland.
That's
And
great.
it's cool, it moves
Yeah.
the conversation forward at a pace that wouldn't happen without that technology.
Yeah. And I suppose the technology also goes into some of those other pieces. You sort of cover a little bit in the book, but I know you've spoken about in the past around climate mitigation. Trees promising to be huge carbon sinks and offering different values of some of our climate issues that we are facing globally. What are your thoughts around people that are investing in climate smart tree investments? And is that something that folks should be interested in as part of enabling the food forest momentum or movement? Or do you think that's a little bit of a wrong direction or a misstep?
I don't know if I know enough about that sector to say, but I would say that
Sure.
in
Yeah.
general, I do feel like we often look for these big global solutions, um, that then still involve sort of like a small group of people controlling a large area.
Mm-hmm.
And that model is how we got to where we are. And I don't think it's going to get us out of it. So I would rather see experimentation and movement toward large groups of local people controlling local resources and learning how to steward our own places. I think that if we really want to stabilize our climate and our culture and our economy and so many other things that are in crisis, it's not, we talk about climate change, we talk about things in silos a lot in our culture, but
Yeah.
all the crises that we're experiencing are related. And I think they're all about relationships, our relationship to each other, our relationship to the place where we live. And
Yeah.
a lot of that has to do with this model of a few groups, a few, small group of people controlling a lot of resources. It's not a model for ecological success. So
Yeah.
I guess,
Decentralization is kind of what you're talking about.
yeah,
And
and
yeah.
relocalization of
Yeah.
not just control, but like understanding. And, so many of us don't really know anything about the resources that meet our most basic needs. And that is actually, as we saw a glimpse of during COVID, a pretty precarious and fragile setup. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
it's
Yeah,
not
I'd
the
agree with
direction
that.
I want to go in.
Yeah. 100%. Have you had any livestock that's been raised in around food forests? Pigs
So
or
I
sheep or
definitely, yeah, I've definitely eaten other people's livestock. I live on an
yeah.
extremely small piece of land on Cape Cod. I do have chickens,
Oh, nice.
and they're super fun. I love them. We have this mulberry tree outside here, and that is one of their favorite treats in the world is when the mulberries are ripe and they get to go hang out under the mulberry tree.
Nice.
Um, but there's definitely uh, a long history of people incorporating livestock into a lot of these systems. I spent some
Mm-hmm.
time in a place called the New Forest in England, which is an incredibly cool place. I got to know a couple of women who are commoners there. And commoner is a formal legal term in England. There have been common lands there as far back as we know, and commoners have specific rights and legal rights to use that land. And it's
Mm-hmm.
become increasingly less I'll say usual because I don't want to use the word common again and confuse you, but less common for people to exercise these rights and to use them. But the New Forest is one of the oldest continually operated commons in England, and a huge component of the ecosystem is livestock. So they have rights of pannage, which is the right to turn out pigs on the autumn nut harvest. So
Right.
when chestnuts and acorns and other nuts start falling, there's a period of between, I think, 60 and 90 days where commoners with pigs are allowed to turn out their animals to
Mm.
fatten on these nuts. The women I talked to were pony owners. So they have these ponies. And the New Forest is like this vast area, including villages. So you'll be in a village and there'll be like pigs and donkeys and horses just on the road, walking through the villages. They're not fenced out. They're just part of the whole scene. And if you want to
Yeah.
protect an area like your garden or whatever, you have to fence it in. It's your job to protect it from them, not the animal owner's job to keep them out.
Wow.
So that was a pretty cool experience to be in this area where this tradition has been going on for hundreds, probably thousands of years. And everyone there's just used to it. There's
Mm-hmm.
pigs in the road eating acorns, and then you'll go to the pub and there'll be pork on the menu and it'll say New Forest pork. Uh, so that was probably one of the coolest livestock forest experiences I've had. It's just completely integrated into the culture and the place.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd be very fascinated to do some comparisons on pigs that are foraging in a food forest and livestock as well in terms of flavor and the omega-6s and 3s and how that changes the protein
Yeah,
levels. Yeah.
I think there's definitely, I want to say it was from Spain, from some of the dehesas there, which are these
Hmm.
ancient oak agroforestry ecosystems where pigs are very much a part of it. And I want to say there are some studies showing that the lipid profile of that pork is significantly healthier for humans than the lipid profile of animals fed, a conventional American grain
Yeah.
diet. Um,
Yeah.
I'll have to look that up. I'll see if I can find it for you because I remember seeing it and thinking, "All right, this is exciting."
Yeah. Yeah. I'd love to read that. Certainly, livestock are a big part of how we regenerate ecosystems. And when we think about bringing trees back in, I hadn't actually until today put the connection together about food forests in terms of being able to actually feed them, not just the native grasses and the forage and the rations that we're so used to um, providing for them. So yeah, very interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah, there's definitely a big history there for sure,
Yeah.
and a lot of
Yeah.
potential.
Excellent. Well, we're nearing the end of our discussion here, and I've learned a lot, and I've loved this conversation. I'd love to just give you the floor to share with our audience and the broader audience that's going to listen in. Anything you'd like to share in terms of where you can find your new book, any speaking engagements you have coming up, or anything you'd like our audience to know.
Yeah. Um, my phone is ringing. Let me turn it off so that you don't have
No
to edit.
worries.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Apologies.
All good.
Um,
We live life with technology these days. It's not.
yes, it is. um, so my new book is called Feed Us with Trees, Nuts and the Future of Food. Came out July 15th and is now in bookstores, available online at most major retailers. And people can find me also on my website, which is elspethhay.com. I am on Instagram, sometimes reluctantly, but also really enjoy seeing what other people are up to in the agroforestry world on there. And I do have some upcoming events, mostly on Cape Cod this summer. So if people are out Cape Cod way, look me up for sure. And then this fall, I am planning a bit of a nut tour. And if anyone has must stop areas where there's a big interest in agroforestry or nut based farming, please reach out and let me know. I'm in the process of setting those dates right now, and I would love to come to your community if you've got a bunch of interested folks.
Fantastic. And what's the best way to contact you? Would it be through your website and contact information there?
Yeah, through my website. People can also email me. My email is just my name. It's elspeth.hay@gmail.com. So it's easy.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day today and sharing more about nuts and food forests. We all have some homework to do. Go experiment with producing nutritious food from the canopies of trees and share
Yeah,
that
send
information
me
back
your
with Elspeth.
recipe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Thank you so much. This was really fun. I appreciate it.
likewise. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Have a good one.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Grow Renaissance podcast. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe this episode. Remember, it will take a community of us to do the best in the world and truly nourish not only ourselves, but the planet, the atmosphere, the soil, the plants, and the animals on it. So make sure you spread this message anywhere that you can.